Sometimes the people we overlook the most are the ones willing to give everything for us. In the small town of Cedar Ridge, Jake Sullivan was just another forgotten soul, a homeless cowboy who'd been drifting through their lives for 3 years. Sleeping in abandoned barns and taking whatever work folks would give him, most of the 500 townspeople barely noticed him, seeing only his worn boots and patched coat. But when fire tore through the preacher's house one evening and 10-year-old Annie was trapped inside, everything changed in an instant. While others stood frozen, Jake didn't hesitate. He wrapped his coat around his face and charged straight into those flames. He carried that little girl to safety before collapsing from the smoke. What happened next would shock everyone. The entire town came together to do something that would give Jake what he hadn't had in decades, a real home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years earlier, Jake Sullivan had arrived in Cedar Ridge on a freight train that barely slowed down long enough for a man to jump off. He'd landed hard in the gravel beside the tracks, his worn duffel bag skittering across the stones. And for a moment he'd just lain there watching the train disappear into the Montana wilderness. The autumn air had carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and something about this place had whispered that maybe, just maybe, he could rest here for a while. That first winter had nearly killed him. The abandoned garret barn on the outskirts of town became his shelter, its roof patched with whatever scraps of tin and tarp he could find. The wind would howl through the gaps in the boards, and Jake would lie awake listening to it, remembering other sounds from other places he'd rather forget. During those long, cold nights, he'd press his hand to his chest, where the dog tags lay hidden beneath his shirts, the only reminder of who he used to be before the world went sideways. But Jake was a survivor. He'd learned that skill in the jungles of Vietnam, and he'd perfected it in the years since. By his second week in Cedar Ridge, he'd found work mucking stalls at Henderson's ranch for $20 a day and whatever food Martha Henderson could spare. She was a kind woman, with silver hair and gentle eyes who never asked questions about the nightmares that sometimes left Jake shaking in the barn at dawn. "You eat like a man who's forgotten what regular meals taste like," she'd observed one afternoon, setting an extra plate of cornbread on the fence post where Jake was mending wire. She never made him come inside, somehow understanding that walls still felt too much like cages to him, but she made sure he didn't go hungry. The work suited him. Horses didn't judge a man by his past, or wonder why his hands sometimes trembled when thunder rolled across the plains. They only cared that he was gentle and consistent, and Jake had plenty of both to offer. He'd always had a way with animals, even as a boy growing up on his father's farm in Nebraska. His touch could calm a spooked colt or coax a sick heifer back to health, skills that served him well in his wandering years. Cedar Ridge itself was the kind of town that time seemed to have overlooked. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with false-fronted buildings that had weathered a century of prairie storms. Morrison's general store anchored one end, its wooden floors creaking under the weight of supplies and gossip. The other end belonged to the Rusty Spur Saloon, where ranchers gathered after long days to nurse beers and debate everything from cattle prices to the weather. Between them stood the pillars of small-town life. Preacher Watson's white-clapboard church with its modest steeple, Dr. Reynolds' clinic with its perpetually squeaky door, and the post office, where old-timers gathered each morning to solve the world's problems over coffee and yesterday's newspaper. Sheriff Murphy kept the peace from his one-room office, though the most excitement Cedar Ridge usually saw was the occasional drunk cowboy or wandering cattle in someone's garden. The people were good folks mostly, hard-working ranchers and shop owners who'd built their lives around family, faith, and the rhythm of the seasons. They nodded politely when Jake passed on the street, and some even offered him odd jobs when word got around that he was reliable and skilled with his hands. But there was always that distance, that careful space that marked him as an outsider. Jake understood. He was a drifter, a man with no past they could point to and no future they could predict. His clothes were patched and his boots worn thin, and he carried himself with the quiet wariness of someone who'd learned not to expect much from the world. To them, he was temporary, a seasonal worker who'd move on when the mood struck him or the money ran out. What they didn't know was that Jake remembered everything. He remembered young Tommy Morrison helping his grandfather stock shelves after school, his face serious with concentration. He remembered Mrs. Fletcher crying quietly in the clinic waiting room the day the doctor told her about her husband's cancer. He remembered Sheriff Murphy's hands shaking slightly when he thought no one was looking, the way they did for men who'd seen too much war. Jake noticed because noticing had kept him alive once upon a time. In Vietnam, the medic who paid attention was the one who brought his boys home. He'd carried that skill into civilian life, though these days it only served to make him feel more isolated. He saw the way Martha Henderson favored her left hip when the weather turned cold, saw the exhaustion in Dr. Reynolds' eyes after working 36 hours straight during flu season, saw the loneliness in old Mr. Garrett's face when he sat on his porch in the evenings with no one to talk to. But seeing and acting were different things. Jake had learned to keep his distance, to offer help only when directly asked, and to disappear back into the shadows when the work was done. It was safer that way, for everyone involved. The abandoned barn became more than shelter. It became sanctuary. Jake had cleaned it out board by board, sweeping away years of accumulated debris and making small improvements where he could. He'd built a crude but functional wood stove from salvaged metal, and he'd repaired the worst of the roof leaks with tin scraps and determination. In one corner, he'd arranged his few possessions, a bedroll, a small crate that served as a table, and the worn leather journal where he sometimes wrote when the memories pressed too close to the surface. The journal was his secret, filled with fragments of thoughts and half-finished letters to people who'd never read them. Sometimes he wrote about the weather or the horses he'd worked with that day. Other times, when the whiskey couldn't quiet the ghosts, he wrote about Sarah and Emily, about the life he'd lost and the man he used to be. Those pages were stained with more than ink, but they were the only way he knew to keep their memory alive without letting it destroy him completely. Winter evenings were the hardest. When the sun set early and the wind picked up, Jake would hunker down in his makeshift home and try not to think about warm houses with lit windows and families gathered around dinner tables. He'd taught himself to be grateful for what he had. A dry place to sleep, work that paid enough for food and fuel, and a town that let him exist on its edges without too many questions. But sometimes, especially when he glimpsed families together through restaurant windows or heard children laughing in the school playground, the loneliness would hit him like a physical blow. Those were the nights when he'd pull out the journal and write until his hand cramped, trying to pour the ache onto paper where it couldn't tear him apart from the inside. Spring brought easier times. There was more work available, and the warmer weather meant he could spend more time outdoors. Jake found odd jobs all over town, fixing Mrs. Fletcher's fence, helping old Mr. Garrett with his garden, cleaning gutters for anyone willing to pay a few dollars for the service. He developed a reputation as a man who showed up when he said he would and did good work for fair pay. Dr. Reynolds hired him to build shelves in the clinic storage room, and Jake couldn't help but notice the doctor's outdated medical supplies and the way he stretched everything to last longer than it should. When he finished the shelves, Jake quietly left behind a few basic first aid items he'd acquired during his travels. Nothing expensive or suspicious, just gauze and antiseptic that might help someone in need. It became a pattern. Jake would complete a job and then find small ways to give back, fixing a loose step that hadn't been part of the work order, oiling a squeaky gate, leaving fresh eggs from Martha's chickens on the porch of elderly folks who couldn't get around as well as they used to. He never took credit and never expected thanks. It was just something he needed to do, a way of trying to balance the scales for all the help he couldn't give when it mattered most. By his third summer in Cedar Ridge, Jake had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. He had his regular jobs, his quiet routines, and a handful of people who genuinely seemed to appreciate his work. He'd even started attending the occasional community event, staying on the edges, of course, but allowing himself to be part of the crowd at the 4th of July picnic or the Harvest Festival. It was during one of those festivals that he first really noticed Annie Watson. She was 7 then, a bright-eyed girl with pigtails who helped her father, Preacher Watson, distribute food to the needy families in town. Jake had been hired to help set up tables and chairs, and he'd watched from a distance as Annie carefully ladled soup into containers, her tongue poking out in concentration as she tried not to spill. Something about her reminded him of Emily at that age, the serious way she approached her responsibilities, the gap-toothed smile she flashed when someone thanked her for the food. It was a painful recognition, but also somehow comforting. For just a moment, Jake allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be proud of a child's kindness. Annie had caught him watching and waved, her smile bright as sunshine. Jake had nodded politely and gone back to his work, but the warmth of that simple gesture had stayed with him for days afterward. Preacher Watson was a good man, the kind of minister who practiced what he preached and never made anyone feel judged for their circumstances. He'd occasionally hired Jake for odd jobs around the church, always paying fairly and treating him with genuine respect. During those conversations, Jake had learned that Annie's mother had died when she was just 3, leaving the preacher to raise his daughter alone. "She's got her mother's heart," Watson had said one afternoon as they watched Annie playing with the church's old dog, always looking out for folks who need a friend. Jake had understood why the townspeople gravitated toward Preacher Watson. He had a way of making everyone feel valued, regardless of their station in life. He never preached down to his congregation or made them feel ashamed of their struggles. Instead, he offered practical help along with spiritual guidance, organizing food drives and work programs that kept families afloat during hard times. As autumn turned toward winter in his 3rd year, Jake had begun to think that maybe he'd found a place where he could stay. It wasn't the life he'd once imagined for himself, but it was peaceful and honest work among decent people. He'd even started making small improvements to the barn that suggested a longer-term commitment, banking the walls with earth for better insulation, building a proper shelf for his few books, adding a small window to let in natural light. The nightmares still came, but less frequently. The guilt still gnawed at him during quiet moments, but he'd learned to channel it into useful work. He wasn't healing exactly, but he wasn't getting worse either. For a man who'd spent years convinced he didn't deserve happiness, that felt like progress. Martha Henderson had begun inviting him to stay for dinner occasionally, and he'd surprised himself by accepting. They would sit on her porch afterward, watching the sun set over the mountains, and she would tell him stories about the early days of Cedar Ridge, about the families who'd built the town with their bare hands and the challenges they'd overcome. Together, community isn't just about blood relations, she'd said one evening, rocking gently in her chair. Sometimes it's about the family you choose, the people who see something worth saving in you, even when you can't see it yourself. Jake had thought about those words often in the weeks that followed. He'd spent so long believing that he was meant to be alone, that connection was too dangerous for someone carrying his kind of pain. But watching the people of Cedar Ridge care for each other, flawed and human and real, had started to plant small seeds of hope in the wasteland of his heart. He'd even begun to think about the future in concrete terms. Maybe he could save enough money to buy the old Garrett place when it came up for sale. Maybe he could build something more permanent than a shelter, something that looked like home. It was a fragile dream, easily shattered, but it was the first real hope he'd allowed himself in years. Then came that October evening when the smell of smoke drifted across town and everything changed forever. The evening prayer meeting at Cedar Ridge Community Church had been particularly well attended that October night. Preacher Watson's sermon about finding light in dark times had resonated with folks dealing with a difficult harvest season, and the fellowship afterward had stretched longer than usual. Annie Watson had helped serve coffee and cookies to the lingering congregation, her 10-year-old hands steady as she carefully poured from the heavy pot her father had taught her to manage. Jake had been walking back from Henderson's ranch when he first caught the scent on the wind, that acrid smell that made every nerve in his body snap to attention. Smoke, not the comfortable wood smoke from chimneys that usually perfumed cedar Bridges' autumn evenings, but the sharp, urgent smell of something burning that shouldn't be. He'd quickened his pace, his worn boots finding familiar purchase on the gravel road. Years of military training and survival instincts kicked in as he scanned the horizon, looking for the telltale orange glow that would reveal the source. It didn't take long to find it. The warm light spilling from the windows of the parsonage, the modest two-story house beside the church where Preacher Watson and Annie lived, had turned the wrong color. By the time Jake reached Main Street at a dead run, others had noticed too. People were streaming out of the church, their faces shifting from confusion to alarm as they saw flames licking at the windows of the parsonage's upper floor. Someone was shouting about calling the volunteer fire department. But Jake knew from experience that help was still 20 minutes away, and 20 minutes was a lifetime when fire was involved. "Where's Annie?" Preacher Watson's voice cut through the growing chaos, high with panic. "Has anyone seen Annie?" Jake's blood turned to ice water. The preacher had been leading the final prayer when the fire started, focused on his congregation rather than watching his daughter. In the confusion of discovery and evacuation, a 10-year-old girl could easily slip away unnoticed. She went upstairs to get her homework, called out Mrs. Fletcher, her face pale in the firelight. "Right before we smelled the smoke." "Oh, dear Lord!" The words hit Jake like physical blows. A child trapped on the second floor of a burning building. Every instinct screamed at him to move, but for a terrible moment he was frozen, caught between the present emergency and memories of other fires, other children he'd been too late to save. Sheriff Murphy was already organizing the growing crowd, his voice steady despite the crisis. "Everyone stay back. The fire department's been called. We need to keep the area clear for when they arrive." But Jake was studying the building with different eyes. The fire had started in the kitchen on the ground floor, probably from the old wood stove that heated the house, and was spreading upward through the walls. The staircase would be impassable soon, if it wasn't already. The front windows on the second floor were too high for a safe jump, but there was a smaller window on the side of the house, the one in Annie's bedroom that faced the old oak tree. 20 minutes. The volunteer firefighters were good men, but they were farmers and shopkeepers who did this work part-time. By the time they arrived with equipment, the second floor would be fully engulfed. A 10-year-old girl didn't have 20 minutes. Jake stepped forward, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that came in life-or-death moments. Around him, the crowd was growing larger as more townspeople arrived, their voices rising in prayer and panic. Someone had brought a ladder from Morrison's hardware store, but it was too short to reach the second-floor windows safely. "I'm going in," Jake announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making split-second decisions under pressure. "Jake, no." Sheriff Murphy grabbed his arm. "It's too dangerous. The whole place could come down." Jake gently but firmly pulled free. "That little girl doesn't have time to wait for the fire department. I've done this before." It wasn't entirely true. He'd rescued wounded soldiers from burning vehicles in Vietnam, but that was different from a house fire. Still, the principles were the same. Stay low, move fast, and don't think about the 1,000 ways it could go wrong. He was already shrugging out of his worn denim jacket, wrapping it around his head and shoulders to protect against the heat and flying embers. The fabric smelled of horses and honest work, familiar scents that grounded him as he approached the burning building. "Annie!" he called out as loudly as he could. "Annie, can you hear me?" A faint response came from somewhere above, a child's voice, frightened but alive. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he located the sound. She was in her bedroom, trapped by smoke and fear. The front door was already too hot to touch, but Jake had noticed that the side entrance, the one that led into the mudroom, was still clear. He kicked it open and was immediately hit by a wall of heat and smoke that made his eyes water and his lungs seize. The roar of the fire was deafening, like standing next to a freight train. Jake dropped to his hands and knees, staying below the worst of the smoke as he crawled through the mudroom and into the main house. The heat was incredible, like being inside an oven, and every breath was a struggle. But he could hear Annie crying somewhere above him, and that sound pulled him forward when every survival instinct told him to retreat. The staircase was still passable, barely. Jake could see flames starting to eat through the wall beside it, and the wooden steps creaked ominously under his weight. He took them two at a time, knowing he had minutes at most before the structure became too compromised. "Annie," he called again, his voice hoarse from smoke. "I'm coming to get you." "I'm scared," came the response, clearer now that he was on the second floor. "I can't get out." Jake followed her voice to a door at the end of the hallway. The wood was hot to the touch, but not yet burning. He turned the handle and found Annie huddled in the far corner of her bedroom, a damp towel pressed to her face. "Smart girl. Someone had taught her about smoke inhalation." "Hey there, sweetheart," Jake said, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the chaos around them. "I'm Jake. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to be very brave, okay?" Annie nodded, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. She was clutching something in her free hand, a small bracelet made of colorful string and beads, the kind of craft project children made in Sunday school. Jake quickly assessed their options. The hallway was filling with smoke, and he could hear the fire eating its way through the floor below. The window was their only chance, but it was a 12-foot drop to the ground. Not impossible for an adult, but potentially fatal for a child. "I'm going to carry you," he told Annie, kneeling down to her level. "Wrap your arms around my neck and hold on tight. Don't let go no matter what happens, understand?" Annie nodded again, and Jake felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. This wasn't just about saving a life. This was about saving this particular life. This bright-eyed girl who reminded him so much of Emily, who deserved to grow up and have adventures, and maybe children of her own someday. He scooped Annie into his arms, feeling how small and fragile she was against his chest. The bracelet she'd been clutching pressed against his neck as she wrapped her arms around him. Outside, he could hear the crowd shouting encouragement and fear in equal measure. Jake made it to the window and looked down. The townspeople had spread out a tarp below, but it wasn't ideal. He'd have to try to break their fall without crushing Annie in the process. "Close your eyes," he told her gently. "And remember, don't let go." He kicked out the window screen and swung one leg over the sill. The heat behind them was growing unbearable, and he could feel the floor starting to sag beneath his feet. Time was up. Jake jumped. The fall lasted forever and no time at all. He twisted in the air, trying to position himself to take the impact while protecting Annie, and then they hit the tarp with jarring force. Pain shot through Jake's shoulder and ribs, but Annie was moving and crying, which meant she was alive and breathing. Strong hands pulled them both away from the building, just as the second-floor windows exploded outward in a shower of glass and flame. Jake tried to stand, to make sure Annie was really okay, but his legs wouldn't support him. The adrenaline was wearing off, and smoke inhalation was making everything fuzzy around the edges. "You did it," someone was saying. "Sheriff Murphy, maybe, or Dr. Reynolds. You got her out. You saved her." Jake felt something being pressed into his hand, the string bracelet Annie had been holding. She must have dropped it during the rescue, and someone had retrieved it from the top. "For you," came Annie's voice, small but determined. "Because you saved me." Jake tried to respond, tried to tell her she was the brave one, but the smoke had done its work on his lungs. The world tilted sideways, and the last thing he remembered before consciousness slipped away was the sound of sirens, finally approaching in the distance, and the feeling of small fingers squeezing his hand when the volunteer fire department arrived 15 minutes later. They found the parsonage fully engulfed and beyond saving, but they also found a 10-year-old girl, safe in her father's arms, and a homeless cowboy who'd risked everything to make sure she stayed that way. In the days that followed, that image would be burned into the collective memory of Cedar Ridge, the moment when an invisible man became a hero, and a community began to see clearly for the first time. Jake woke up in Dr. Reynolds' clinic 3 days later, his throat raw and his ribs wrapped tight enough to make breathing an effort. The small room smelled of antiseptic and lavender. Someone had brought flowers, and afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that looked out on Main Street. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or why everything hurt. Then it all came rushing back. The fire, Annie's frightened face, the sickening drop from the second-story window. "Well, look who's decided to rejoin the living," Dr. Reynolds said from the doorway, his weathered face creasing into a relieved smile. "We were starting to worry you might sleep through Halloween." Jake tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Fire shot through his left shoulder, and his head spun like he'd been drinking rot-gut whiskey. "Annie, is she?" "She's fine. Couple of scratches, some smoke inhalation, but nothing that won't heal. She's been asking about you every day." Dr. Reynolds moved to check Jake's pupils with a small flashlight. "You, on the other hand, have smoke inhalation, 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder we had to pop back into place, and more bruises than I can count. You're lucky to be alive." The relief Jake felt at hearing Annie was safe nearly overwhelmed him. He'd had nightmares during his fever dreams, images of flames and small hands reaching for help that never came. Knowing she was truly okay felt like a weight lifting from his chest. "I need to get back to—" Jake started to swing his legs over the side of the examination table, but Dr. Reynolds placed a firm hand on his good shoulder. "You're not going anywhere for at least another week. And before you start protesting, it's not up for discussion. You've got pneumonia starting in your left lung, and if you don't rest and let it heal properly, it could kill you." Jake had never been good at being still, especially not in enclosed spaces that reminded him too much of field hospitals and recovery wards. But the doctor's tone brooked no argument, and Jake found he didn't have the energy to fight anyway. The rescue had taken more out of him than he'd initially realized. "Besides," Dr. Reynolds continued, settling into the chair beside the bed, "half the town's been by to check on you. Folk are pretty grateful for what you did. Martha Henderson's been cooking enough food to feed an army. And I think every woman in Cedar Ridge has contributed something to the pile in my waiting room." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Martha Henderson appeared in the doorway carrying a steaming bowl and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested arguing would be futile. "Jacob Sullivan," she said, using his full name in a way that reminded him powerfully of his own mother. "You look like death warmed over. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Jake couldn't remember. The days before the fire seemed like a lifetime ago, and he'd been surviving on coffee and whatever scraps he could afford for longer than he cared to admit. Martha seemed to read the answer in his silence and shook her head with motherly disapproval. "Well, that stops right now. Dr. Reynolds, this man needs building up, not just patching together." She set the bowl on the small table beside the bed, and the rich aroma of beef stew made Jake's stomach clench with sudden hunger. "I've brought enough for 3 meals, and I expect to see every bowl licked clean." Over the next few days, Jake learned what it meant to be the center of a small town's attention. People he'd worked for over the years stopped by with awkward gratitude and offerings. Sheriff Murphy brought a bottle of good whiskey. Mrs. Fletcher contributed homemade bread, and even old Mr. Garrett shuffled in with a carved wooden figure of a horse that he pressed into Jake's hands without explanation. But it was Annie's visits that both healed and wounded him most deeply. She came every afternoon after school, clutching whatever small gift she'd chosen that day, a drawing, a picked flower, a smooth stone she'd found by the creek. She would sit in the chair beside his bed and chatter about her day, about her father's plans to rebuild the parsonage, about the new kitten that had shown up at the church. "Papa says you're a hero," she announced one afternoon, swinging her legs from the oversized chair. "He says God sent you to save me." Jake shifted uncomfortably, both from his physical pain and the weight of such faith. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart. Just a man who was in the right place at the right time. That's what heroes always say," Annie replied with the absolute certainty that only children possess. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something familiar, a photograph, creased and faded with age. "I found this in your jacket pocket when Papa was washing it." "Is this your family?" Jake's breath caught. The photo showed a younger version of himself in military fatigues. his arm around a beautiful woman with kind eyes, while a little girl with pigtails grinned at the camera from her perch on his shoulders. Sarah and Emily, frozen in time during their last visit to see him before his final deployment. "Yes," he managed, his voice thick with emotion he thought he'd learned to control. "That's my wife Sarah and my daughter Emily. Where are they now?" The simple question hung in the air like smoke. Jake had spent years avoiding this conversation, deflecting inquiries with vague answers and quick changes of subject. But looking into Annie's earnest face, seeing the genuine curiosity and care there, he found he couldn't lie to her. "They died," he said quietly, "a long time ago, in a car accident while I was overseas." Annie's face crumpled with sympathy that was far too mature for her years. "I'm sorry. That must have made you very sad." "It did. It still does." Jake took the photograph back, running his thumb over the familiar faces. "That's why I've been moving around so much. It's hard to stay in one place when everywhere reminds you of what you've lost. But you saved me," Annie said with the logic of childhood. "And maybe that's why you came here. Maybe they sent you to save me because they couldn't save themselves." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they offered a perspective he'd never considered. For years, he'd seen his survival as a punishment, a cosmic joke that had left him alive while taking everyone who mattered. But what if it was something else? What if there was purpose in the pain? He was still pondering that possibility when Preacher Watson arrived for his evening visit. The man looked older than his 45 years, his face lined with the stress of nearly losing his daughter and the challenges of rebuilding his home and congregation's gathering place. "Jake," he said, settling into the chair Annie had vacated, "I wanted to thank you properly, away from all the fuss and noise. What you did, running into that fire, it wasn't just brave. It was the act of someone who understands the value of a life, who's willing to risk everything for a stranger." Jake shook his head. "Annie's not a stranger. She's a good kid. Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Preacher Watson said firmly. "Most people would have waited for help to arrive. Most people would have found reasons why someone else should take the risk. You didn't hesitate, and that tells me something important about who you are, underneath all that armor you wear." The conversation was making Jake uncomfortable, all this talk of heroism and character. He'd spent so long thinking of himself as broken, as someone who'd failed the people who mattered most, that accepting praise felt wrong somehow. "I used to be a medic," he found himself saying, though he hadn't planned to share that information. "In Vietnam. It was my job to run toward danger, to save people who couldn't save themselves. I guess some habits die hard." Preacher Watson leaned forward with interest. "That explains a lot. Dr. Reynolds mentioned you knew more about treating injuries than most civilians. How long were you over there?" "2 tours. Nearly 3 years total." Jake's fingers found the dog tags beneath his hospital gown, the metal still warm against his skin. "Lost a lot of good men. Saved some too, but never enough. War leaves marks on a man's soul," the preacher said gently. "I've counseled enough veterans to know that coming home isn't always the blessing it should be. Sometimes the memories follow you, and peace becomes harder to find than the next battle." Jake nodded, surprised by how accurately this small-town minister had summed up his struggle. "I kept moving because staying still meant thinking too much. Thinking about who I couldn't save, what I should have done differently. And now..." It was a simple question, but Jake found he didn't have a simple answer. For the first time in years, he was thinking about staying somewhere, about putting down roots that went deeper than survival. The people of Cedar Ridge had seen him at his most vulnerable and hadn't turned away. They'd brought food and flowers and awkward gratitude, treating him not like a charity case, but like family. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "This place, these people, they're different than what I'm used to. They're making it hard to keep running." Preacher Watson smiled. "Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that we deserve kindness, that we're worth saving, even when we couldn't save others. Annie thinks you were sent here for a reason, and I'm starting to think she might be right." As the minister left that evening, Jake lay in the narrow clinic bed and stared at the ceiling, turning the conversation over in his mind. For years, he'd measured his worth by his failures, by the lives he couldn't save, and the family he'd lost. But maybe there was another way to look at it. Maybe the question wasn't why he'd survived when others hadn't, but what he was supposed to do with the life he'd been given. Outside his window, Cedar Ridge was settling into evening routines. Families gathering for dinner, children finishing homework, neighbors checking on each other with the casual intimacy of a community that cared. For the first time since Sarah and Emily died, Jake allowed himself to imagine being part of something like that again. It was a terrifying thought, but also strangely comforting. He pulled out the string bracelet Annie had given him, studying the careful knots and bright colors in the lamplight. Such a simple thing, made by small hands with generous intent. But it felt like a lifeline, a connection to something larger than his own pain and guilt. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to see what happened when a broken man let himself be healed by the kindness of strangers who'd become friends. The thought scared him more than charging into a burning building. But for the first time in years, Jake Sullivan was ready to be brave in a different way. The town council meeting was supposed to be about the annual budget and road repairs, but Jake Sullivan had become the elephant in the room that no one wanted to address directly. Mayor Davidson, a portly man who ran the feed store when he wasn't managing municipal affairs, cleared his throat for the third time in 10 minutes and shuffled through papers that everyone knew he wasn't really reading. So, he finally said, "I think we all agree that Jake's actions deserve recognition. The question is what form that recognition should take." Martha Henderson, who served as the council's secretary and unofficial conscience, looked up from her notepad with the kind of expression that suggested she'd already made up her mind. Recognition? That man saved Annie Watson's life. He nearly died doing it. Recognition seems like an awfully small word for what we owe him. "Now, Martha," cautioned Bill Morrison, whose general store formed the economic backbone of Cedar Ridge, "we all appreciate what Jake did, but we need to be practical about this. The man's a drifter. He'll move on eventually, and then what? What if he doesn't want to move on?" The question came from Sheriff Murphy, who'd been quietly observing the discussion from his corner seat. What if we gave him a reason to stay? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For 3 years, Jake had existed on the margins of their community, useful when they needed extra hands, invisible when they didn't. But the fire had changed something fundamental in how they saw him, and more importantly, in how they saw themselves. Dr. Reynolds, whose clinic had become Jake's temporary residence, leaned forward in his chair. "I've been talking to Jake during his recovery. Did you know he was a combat medic? 2 tours in Vietnam, decorated for valor. The man has skills we could use." "What kind of skills?" Mayor Davidson asked, though his tone suggested he was afraid of the answer. "Medical training, for one thing. I'm not getting any younger, and the nearest hospital is 40 miles away. Having someone with field medicine experience could save lives." Dr. Reynolds paused, then added quietly, "He's also the most observant person I've ever met. In the past week, he's noticed things about people's health that they hadn't even mentioned to me." Martha nodded emphatically. "I've been thinking the same thing. Jake sees everything, who's struggling, who needs help, who's too proud to ask for it. Remember last winter when the Garrett family was having trouble? Jake was the one who left firewood on their porch and never said a word about it." "How do you know that?" Bill Morrison asked. "Because I saw him," Martha replied. "I also saw him fix Mrs. Fletcher's fence without being asked, and help old Tom with his groceries when Tom's arthritis was acting up. Jake's been taking care of this community for years. We just never bothered to notice." The admission hung heavy in the room. They were good people, but like most small communities, they'd fallen into the trap of only seeing what they expected to see. Jake had been filed away in their minds as temporary help and harmless drifter, categories that didn't require much attention or concern. Sheriff Murphy cleared his throat. "I think what Martha's trying to say is that maybe we owe Jake more than just a handshake and a pat on the back. Maybe we owe him a chance to belong somewhere." "Belong how?" Mayor Davidson asked. The man lives in an abandoned barn. That's exactly the point, Martha said, her voice gaining strength. We've let a war hero, a man who saved our children, live like a vagrant for 3 years. How does that reflect on us as a community? The questions sparked a heated discussion that revealed more about Cedar Ridge's collective conscience than anyone was comfortable with. Stories emerged of Jake's quiet kindnesses, groceries left anonymously for struggling families, repairs done without being asked, gentle words offered to children who were having bad days. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd been caring for their community, while they barely acknowledged his existence. I've been talking to my wife about this, said Jim Fletcher, the bank manager who rarely spoke at council meetings. She mentioned that Jake helped our oldest boy with his homework one day when he was sitting outside the library, too embarrassed to ask for help inside. Jake explained algebra better than any teacher ever had, then bought the kid an ice cream and told him that being smart was nothing to be ashamed of. Similar stories followed. Jake teaching young Tommy Morrison how to properly stack inventory without making the boy feel clumsy. Jake sitting with old Mrs. Garrett during her husband's funeral, not saying much, but just being present when she needed someone steady beside her. Jake quietly redirecting drunk cowboys away from family areas during town festivals, handling potential trouble before it could escalate. Sweet Lord, breathed Martha Henderson. We've had a guardian angel living in our barn, and we treated him like hired help. The weight of that realization settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. They'd prided themselves on being a caring community, on looking out for their neighbors and helping those in need. But they'd failed to see that one of their most vulnerable residents was also one of their most generous. So what do we do about it? Mayor Davidson asked, his earlier reluctance replaced by something that looked like shame. We do right by him, Sheriff Murphy said firmly. We show Jake Sullivan that Cedar Ridge takes care of its own. The discussion that followed was unlike any town council meeting in Cedar Ridge's history. Instead of arguing about budgets and ordinances, they found themselves planning something unprecedented, a community effort to give one man what he'd never asked for, but clearly deserved. Martha Henderson, as usual, took charge of the practical details. The old Peterson place has been empty for 2 years since they moved to Denver. It's got good bones, but it needs work. If we could get the bank to sell it at a reasonable price, consider it done, Jim Fletcher interrupted. The bank's been trying to move that property anyway. We could work out terms that Jake could manage, maybe with some community assistance. I've got lumber, offered Bill Morrison. Been sitting in my warehouse for months waiting for a buyer. Jake could have it at cost. Dr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. If we're serious about this, we should make it official. Create a position for Jake as community health assistant or something similar. Give him a regular income and a reason to stay. The ideas came fast after that, each person contributing what they could. Materials, labor, expertise, connections. What emerged was a plan that would transform not just Jake's living situation, but his entire relationship with the town. But first, they had to convince him to accept help, and everyone in the room knew that would be the hardest part. Jake Sullivan had spent years learning to expect nothing from people, to rely only on himself. Convincing him to accept an entire community's generosity would require more than good intentions. He'll fight us on this, Martha said, voicing what everyone was thinking. Jake's not comfortable being the center of attention, and he sure isn't used to accepting charity. Then we don't call it charity, Sheriff Murphy suggested. We make it clear that this is about what's best for the community, not just what's best for Jake. We need someone with his skills and experience. This is as much about us as it is about him. Mayor Davidson, who'd started the meeting worried about budget implications, found himself nodding along. You know what? You're right. Jake Sullivan has been serving this community for 3 years without recognition or proper compensation. It's time we made that official. As the meeting wound down, the participants found themselves energized by a sense of purpose they hadn't felt in years. They were about to undertake the biggest community project in Cedar Ridge's recent history. and it felt like the right thing to do in a way that transcended practical considerations. But even as they made their plans, each person in that room knew they were asking Jake to take the biggest risk of all, the risk of trusting a community that had overlooked him for years, the risk of believing that he deserved the kind of belonging he'd been running from since his family died. Outside, the October wind was picking up, carrying the scent of coming winter and change. In Dr. Reynolds' clinic, Jake Sullivan was sleeping peacefully for the first time in years, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he'd never dared to imagine. The people of Cedar Ridge had finally seen him clearly, and they were determined to make sure he never felt invisible again. Whether Jake was ready for that kind of visibility remained to be seen, but the community had made its choice. They were going to save their guardian angel, whether he wanted to be saved or not. The only question now was whether Jake would let them try. Jake discovered the community's plans the way he discovered most things in Cedar Ridge, by accident and observation. He'd been released from Dr. Reynolds' clinic on a crisp November morning with strict instructions to take it easy for another week. But sitting still had never been one of Jake's strengths. By afternoon, he was walking slowly through town, testing his healing ribs and trying to convince himself that the suspicious number of people ducking into Morrison's general store wasn't worth investigating. But old habits died hard, and Jake's survival instincts had been honed by years of watching for danger in unexpected places. When he noticed Bill Morrison's wife carrying building supplies into the store's back room, and when he spotted Sheriff Murphy consulting what looked like architectural drawings, his curiosity got the better of him. He positioned himself across the street from the store, settling onto a bench outside the post office with the patience of a man accustomed to long surveillance. Over the next hour, he watched half the town's adult population enter Morrison's store, most carrying items that had nothing to do with typical grocery shopping: lumber samples, paint swatches, what looked like surveying equipment. They're not very good at keeping secrets, are they? Jake turned to find Annie Watson settling beside him on the bench, her school bag slung over one shoulder and a knowing smile on her face. She'd grown more confident since the fire, less afraid of the world, and more willing to speak her mind. Who's not good at keeping secrets? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The whole town. They've been planning something for weeks, but nobody wants to tell you what it is because they're afraid you'll disappear again. Annie swung her legs from the bench, her shoes not quite reaching the ground. Papa says you have a tendency to run when people try to help you. The casual observation hit closer to home than Jake was comfortable with. Your papa's a wise man. He also says you're scared of being happy because you think it means forgetting the people you loved who died. But that's silly. Annie's voice carried the absolute certainty that only children possess about complex emotional truths. Being happy doesn't mean forgetting. It just means you're alive enough to remember them properly. Jake stared at the 10-year-old beside him, wondering when children had become so insightful about matters that confounded adults. Where'd you learn to think like that? From you, mostly. When you talk about your wife and daughter, you smile even when you're sad. That's how I know you love them enough to be happy again. Before Jake could respond to that unsettling piece of wisdom, Martha Henderson emerged from Morrison's store, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of a woman with a mission. She spotted Jake and Annie on the bench and headed straight for them with determined strides. "Jacob Sullivan," she said, using his full name in that motherly tone that suggested he was about to be lovingly scolded. "What are you doing sitting outside when you should be resting?" "Just getting some fresh air," Jake replied, though his eyes kept drifting to the clipboard in Martha's hands. "Lot of activity at Morrison's today." Martha's cheeks flushed slightly, and she clutched the clipboard closer to her chest. "Oh, you know how it is. People always need supplies for winter preparations." It was a reasonable explanation, but Jake had spent too many years reading people to miss the telltale signs of deception. Martha was avoiding eye contact, shifting her weight from foot to foot, and her grip on that clipboard suggested it contained information she wasn't ready to share. "Martha, Jake said gently. "What's going on?" The direct question seemed to deflate her attempt at subterfuge. She glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then sat down heavily on the bench beside Annie. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We just want to do something nice for you. Something you deserve. But everyone's convinced you'll bolt the moment you find out about it." "Find out about what?" Martha looked to Annie for support, but the girl just shrugged. He was going to figure it out anyway. "Grown-ups are terrible at surprises. We're building you a house," Martha said in a rush, as if saying it quickly would make it less overwhelming. "Well, not building exactly. The Peterson place has been empty for 2 years, and Jim Fletcher worked out a deal with the bank. We're fixing it up, making it livable, and we want you to have it." Jake felt the world tilt sideways. A house. They were giving him a house. The generosity of it was staggering, but more than that, it represented something he'd stopped believing was possible. A permanent place in a community that wanted him to stay. "I can't accept that," he said automatically. The words coming from years of practiced self-denial. "It's too much. I don't have money for—" "It's not charity," Martha interrupted firmly. "Dr. Reynolds wants to hire you as his assistant. Official position, regular salary, health benefits. The town council voted unanimously to create the position. You'd be earning your keep, Jake, more than earning it." The information kept coming, each detail more overwhelming than the last. Not just a house, but a job. Not just temporary help, but a future. Jake's mind raced through all the reasons why this couldn't work, why he shouldn't accept, why it would end badly for everyone involved. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," he said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person for—" "You saved 16 people during your time in Vietnam," Martha said quietly. "Dr. Reynolds looked up your service record. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Commendation for Valor Under Fire. You've been saving people your whole life, Jake. It's time somebody saved you back." Annie's small hand slipped into his, warm and trusting. "Please don't leave," she said simply. "I like having you here." Jake looked down at this child who'd become so important to him in such a short time, who saw him not as a broken veteran or a charity case, but simply as someone worth keeping around. The weight of her trust was both terrifying and healing. "The house needs work," Martha continued, pressing her advantage. "Nothing you can't handle, but it'll take time. Gives you a project, something to focus on, while you decide if this is where you want to be." It was a clever approach, Jake realized. Instead of asking him to commit to staying forever, they were offering him a project with a clear endpoint. He could work on the house, try out the job, test whether belonging was something he could handle. And if it didn't work out well, at least Cedar Ridge would have a renovated house, and he'd have earned his keep honestly. "Can I see it?" he asked finally. "The house, I mean." Martha's face lit up like sunrise. "Of course. Jim Fletcher has the keys, and I think half the town's over there right now, pretending to measure things while they wait to see if you'll show up." As they walked through Cedar Ridge toward the Peterson place, Jake found himself seeing the town with new eyes. The false-fronted buildings that had seemed quaint but temporary now looked like the foundation of something permanent. The people they passed, neighbors, who waved and called out greetings, no longer felt like strangers who tolerated his presence, but like a community that had chosen to include him. The Peterson house sat on 2 acres at the edge of town, close enough to walk to Main Street, but far enough out to provide privacy and space. It was a modest 2-story structure with good bones but obvious neglect, peeling paint, a sagging porch, windows that needed replacing. Jake could see the potential, though. With work and attention, it could be beautiful. More importantly, he could see himself living there. For the first time since Sarah and Emily died, Jake Sullivan could envision a future that extended beyond the next town, the next job, the next escape. It was a terrifying prospect, but also oddly comforting. "What do you think?" Martha asked as they stood in the overgrown front yard. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the house and trying to untangle the complicated emotions churning in his chest. Fear, hope, guilt, and something that might have been gratitude all fought for dominance. "I think," he said finally, "it's going to need a lot of work." Martha's smile could have powered the whole town. Good thing we know a man who's handy with tools and has some time on his hands. Annie squeezed his hand tighter. Does that mean you're staying? Jake looked down at her upturned face, at the hope shining in her eyes, and felt something in his chest crack open for the first time in years. Maybe it was time to stop running from the possibility of happiness. Maybe it was time to build something instead of just surviving. Yeah, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Do you think it does? The cheer that went up from the house suggested that half the town had indeed been hiding inside, waiting for his answer. As people poured out onto the porch and yard, surrounding him with congratulations and plans and offers of help, Jake felt simultaneously overwhelmed and anchored. For better or worse, he was home. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting Cedar Ridge with a thin layer of white that transformed the town into something from a picture postcard. Jake stood at the window of what was slowly becoming his house, watching the flakes drift past the glass while his coffee steamed in the morning air. 3 weeks of work had already made a dramatic difference. The sagging porch had been reinforced, half the exterior had been repainted, and the worst of the interior damage had been repaired. But it was the carved wooden cross sitting on his makeshift workbench that occupied most of his thoughts these days. He'd been working on it during the quiet evening hours, when the other volunteers had gone home, and the house felt empty enough for memories to surface safely. Each careful cut of the knife, each smooth curve, was both meditation and torment. He'd promised himself he would finish it before Christmas, would finally make the journey to the cemetery in Nebraska, where Sarah and Emily lay buried beneath headstones he'd never seen. For 15 years, he'd carried the guilt of not being there when they died, of not being there to say goodbye, of not being there to mark their final resting place with something made by hands that had loved them. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he could see Annie Watson trudging through the snow, her school bag bouncing against her hip and her cheeks red from cold. She'd taken to stopping by after school most days, ostensibly to help with the renovation, but mostly just to talk while he worked. "Good morning, Mr. Jake," she called as she stamped snow off her boots on the newly repaired porch. The formality was a recent development, something Preacher Watson had been encouraging as part of teaching proper manners, though it always made Jake smile. "Morning, sweetheart. No school today?" "Teachers' meeting. Papa's at the church working on his sermon, so I thought I'd come see how the house is looking." Annie peeled off her coat and mittens, hanging them carefully on the hooks Jake had installed by the door. Her eyes immediately went to the cross on the workbench. "That's beautiful. Is it for the church?" Jake's hands stilled on his coffee cup. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing that Annie's curiosity would eventually lead to questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. "No," he said quietly. "It's for my family. For their graves." Annie approached the workbench with the careful reverence children show when they sense they're in the presence of something sacred. She didn't touch the cross, but Jake could see her studying the intricate details he'd carved into the wood. Roses for Sarah, who'd loved gardening, and a small horse for Emily, who'd dreamed of learning to ride. "You're going to visit them," Annie said. It wasn't a question. Yes, before Christmas. The words felt heavy in his mouth, weighted with years of avoidance and grief. "I should have gone a long time ago, but it hurts too much," Annie finished with the matter-of-fact understanding that sometimes came from children who'd experienced loss themselves. "When Mama died, Papa didn't want to go to the cemetery either. He said it made the missing too big to carry." Jake nodded, surprised by how accurately the girl had captured his own feelings. "How did he finally manage it?" "I asked him to take me. I told him I wanted to tell Mama about my school play, about how I'd learned to braid my own hair, about all the things that had happened since she went to heaven. Papa said that's when he realized the cemetery wasn't where Mama was gone. It was where we could go to remember her being with us." The wisdom in those words hit Jake like a physical blow. For years, he'd avoided the cemetery because he'd thought of it as the place where Sarah and Emily had ended. But maybe Annie was right. Maybe it was the place where they continued, where love could be tended like flowers and memories could be shared like conversations. Would you like to see a picture of them? Jake asked impulsively. He'd been carrying the photograph in his wallet for years, but he'd rarely shared it with anyone. Annie nodded solemnly, and Jake pulled out the worn image. Sarah in her blue dress, Emily on his shoulders, all three of them laughing at something long forgotten. They look happy, Annie observed. You look happy too. Different than now, but happy. I was. We all were. Jake studied the photograph, seeing it through Annie's eyes. Your papa was right, you know. I have been afraid that being happy here would mean forgetting them. That's silly, Annie said with characteristic bluntness. Being happy is how you honor people you love. Mama used to say that the best way to remember joy is to keep making it. Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles caught his attention. Through the window, he could see a convoy of trucks and cars making their way up the dirt road toward his house. He recognized most of the vehicles: Sheriff Murphy's patrol car, Dr. Reynolds' old Ford, Martha Henderson's pickup truck loaded with what looked like furniture. Looks like the cavalry's arriving, Jake murmured, though he felt a flutter of anxiety at the sight. He still wasn't entirely comfortable being the center of so much attention and generosity. Annie pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass. Oh, they brought the furniture from the church storage room. And I think that's Mrs. Fletcher with curtains. Over the next hour, Jake's house was transformed by a parade of neighbors carrying everything from a donated sofa to hand-sewn curtains to a kitchen table that had belonged to Martha Henderson's grandmother. Each item came with a story: where it had come from, why it was perfect for Jake's house, how happy the donor was to see it put to good use. But it was Dr. Reynolds who brought the most significant gift. The elderly physician arrived carrying an old-fashioned medical bag, its leather worn smooth by decades of use. This belonged to the town's first doctor, Dr. Reynolds explained as he set the bag on Jake's new kitchen table. Doc Morrison, Bill's great-grandfather? I thought it was time it went back into service. Jake opened the bag with reverent hands, finding it equipped with modern supplies, but retaining the weight of history and purpose. Dr. Reynolds, I can't. You can and you will, the older man interrupted firmly. Jake, I've been the only medical professional in a 40-mile radius for 30 years. I'm 73 years old and I'm tired. This town needs someone with your skills, and that bag belongs with someone who understands what it means to save lives. The weight of the responsibility was overwhelming, but Jake found himself nodding. This wasn't just about accepting help anymore. It was about accepting a role, a purpose, a place in the community that went beyond gratitude for his heroic moment. As the afternoon wore on, and his house filled with the generous offerings of his new neighbors, Jake felt something shifting inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart weren't crumbling. That would have been too dramatic and sudden. Instead, they were developing windows, small openings that let light and warmth seep in gradually. Annie stayed close to his side throughout the afternoon, serving as an unofficial hostess and helping arrange furniture with the serious concentration of someone planning a dollhouse. When Sheriff Murphy arrived with a load of firewood and began stacking it on the porch, she immediately appointed herself his assistant. Mr. Jake's going to visit his family before Christmas, she announced to the sheriff as they worked. He made them a beautiful cross. Sheriff Murphy paused in his stacking, his weathered hands resting on a piece of split oak. That's good, Jake. Hard thing to do, but good. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we have at gravesides. You speak from experience, Jake observed. Lost my boy in Iraq, Murphy said quietly. Took me 3 years to visit his grave. Kept thinking if I didn't go, maybe it wasn't real yet. But avoiding the truth doesn't change it. And eventually you realize you're not just cheating the dead, you're cheating yourself out of the chance to say what needs saying. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from inside the house. Through the window, Jake could see Martha Henderson directing the placement of a rocking chair with the precision of a military commander, while Mrs. Fletcher hung curtains that were apparently not hanging to her satisfaction. This is what community looks like, Sheriff Murphy said, nodding toward the activity inside. Not just the good times and celebrations, but people coming together to lift each other up when life gets heavy. As evening approached and the volunteers began packing up their tools and heading home, Jake found himself standing in a house that looked nothing like the empty shell he'd first seen weeks ago. It was furnished, decorated, and filled with the kind of warmth that came from being touched by many caring hands. Annie was the last to leave, reluctant to end what had clearly been one of the best days she'd had in months. As her father arrived to collect her, she threw her arms around Jake's waist in an impromptu hug. "It looks like home now," she whispered against his shirt. "I'm glad you're staying." After they left, Jake walked through his new house in the gathering darkness, running his hands over furniture that had been gifted with love, touching curtains sewn by generous hands, feeling the weight of belonging settle around him like a warm coat. The wooden cross sat waiting on his workbench, nearly finished now and ready for its purpose. But for the first time since he'd started carving it, Jake wasn't dreading the journey it represented. Instead, he found himself looking forward to introducing Sarah and Emily to his new life, to telling them about Annie and Martha and Dr. Reynolds and all the people who'd chosen to love a broken stranger back to wholeness. Maybe Sheriff Murphy was right. Maybe the hardest conversations were the ones that happened at gravesides. But maybe they were also the most important ones. The conversations that finally allowed the living to make peace with both the past and the future. Outside, snow continued to fall on Cedar Ridge, blanketing the town in quiet beauty and promise. Inside his warm house, Jake Sullivan began planning the most important journey of his life. Jake was replacing a broken window on the second floor when he saw the stranger walking up his front path. December had brought bitter cold to Cedar Ridge, and most folks stayed bundled up indoors unless they had pressing business elsewhere. But this man walked with purpose through the snow, his city clothes and confident stride marking him as an outsider long before Jake could make out his features. Something about the visitor's gait was familiar, though the way he favored his left leg slightly. The set of his shoulders, the determined way he approached the house. Jake's hands stilled on the window frame as recognition dawned, followed immediately by a flood of emotions he wasn't prepared to handle. Michael Sullivan looked older than Jake remembered, his dark hair now streaked with grey, and his face lined with years of worry. But the eyes were the same, Sarah's eyes, the deep brown that all the Sullivan men shared, warm with intelligence and stubborn with determination. Jake's younger brother stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up, his face cycling through disbelief, relief, and something that might have been anger. "Hello, Jake," the words hung in the cold air between them, weighted with 15 years of silence and grief. Jake climbed down from the ladder slowly, buying time to process this impossible moment. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold or shock he couldn't tell. "Michael." His voice came out rougher than intended. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for my brother." Michael's tone was carefully controlled, but Jake could hear the emotion underneath. The one who disappeared after Sarah and Emily's funeral and never bothered to tell his family he was still alive. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Jake had known this conversation would come eventually, had dreaded it for years, but he'd never imagined it happening here, in front of the house that represented his tentative new beginning. "How did you find me?" "You're not exactly keeping a low profile anymore." Michael pulled a folded newspaper from his coat pocket, the Regional Chronicle, with a front-page story about the fire rescue complete with a photograph of Jake carrying Annie from the burning building. "Hero saves child in dramatic rescue. Imagine my surprise reading about my dead brother's heroic actions." Jake stared at the newspaper, realizing with dawning horror that his moment of visibility had consequences he'd never considered. For 15 years, he'd moved through the world like a ghost, leaving no traces that could connect him to his past. But heroes made news, and news traveled far beyond the boundaries of small towns. "You let us think you were dead," Michael continued, his voice rising with suppressed anger. "Do you have any idea what that did to Mom and Dad? What it did to me? I spent 5 years looking for you, checking every morgue, every hospital, every flophouse between here and the Pacific Ocean." The weight of guilt Jake carried suddenly doubled. He'd been so focused on his own pain, his own inability to face a world without Sarah and Emily, that he'd never fully considered what his disappearance would do to the family he'd left behind. "I couldn't," Jake started, then stopped. How could he explain 15 years of running, of feeling like he didn't deserve to live when his wife and daughter were dead, of believing that his family was better off without the broken shell he'd become? Couldn't what? Couldn't pick up a phone? Couldn't write a letter? Couldn't let your own mother know her son was alive? Michael's composure was cracking, revealing the pain underneath. "She still sets a place for you at Christmas dinner, Jake. Still." The image of his mother, now in her 70s, setting out plates for a son she believed was dead, nearly brought Jake to his knees. Margaret Sullivan had been the heart of their family, the one who held everyone together through farm crises and military deployments and teenage rebellions. The thought of causing her 15 years of unnecessary grief was almost unbearable. "They're both still alive?" Jake asked quietly. "Barely. Dad had a heart attack 2 years ago. Still refuses to admit he's getting old, but he's slowed down considerably." Michael's voice softened slightly. "Mom never gave up hope that you'd come home someday. She used to drive me crazy with her feelings that you were still out there somewhere." Jake closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his selfishness. He'd thought he was protecting his family from his pain, but instead he'd inflicted a different kind of suffering. The agony of not knowing, of hoping against hope, of loving someone who'd chosen to disappear. "I need to sit down," Jake said, sinking onto the porch steps despite the cold. Michael hesitated for a moment, then joined him, the brothers sitting side by side for the first time since Sarah and Emily's funeral. "I'm sorry," Jake said finally. "I'm so damn sorry, Michael. I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't thinking at all. I couldn't handle being around people who remembered them, who expected me to be the same person I was before. So you became nobody instead." "Yeah, I became nobody." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching their breath form clouds in the frigid air. Jake could hear the normal sounds of Cedar Ridge going about its afternoon business, children playing in the distance, the rumble of trucks on Main Street, the gentle creak of settling wood that came with old buildings and cold weather. "Tell me about them," Michael said eventually. "Sarah and Emily, what happened that night?" It was the conversation Jake had been avoiding for 15 years. But sitting here with his brother, the last living connection to his old life, he found the words coming easier than expected. "It was Christmas Eve. I was supposed to come home that week. But there was a medical emergency at the base, a training accident with multiple casualties. I was the senior medic, so I couldn't leave." Jake's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched tight. "Sarah understood. She always understood. Said they'd wait up for me, that we'd open presents when I got home." Michael nodded, encouraging him to continue. They were driving to midnight mass at St. Mary's. Emily was so excited about the Christmas pageant. She was playing an angel. "They never made it to the church." Jake's voice broke slightly. "Drunk driver ran a red light downtown. Killed them both instantly, and you blamed yourself. I was supposed to protect them. That was my job, as a husband, as a father, as a medic. I was trained to save lives, and I couldn't save the 2 lives that mattered most." Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing the story he'd only heard in fragments from police reports and newspaper accounts. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "Jake, you couldn't have prevented that accident. Being there wouldn't have changed anything except that we'd have lost you too. I know that intellectually. But knowing something and feeling it are different things." Jake looked at his brother for the first time since they'd sat down. "I couldn't handle being around people who knew them, who remembered us as a family. Every conversation, every holiday, every normal moment felt like a betrayal of their memory. So, you punished yourself by disappearing. I thought I was protecting everyone from having to—" "Watch me fall apart," Michael stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the snow-covered yard and the life his brother had built in this unlikely place. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from anger to something more complex. "You know what the real tragedy is, Jake? Mom and Dad, they needed to grieve with you. They needed to help you through it, and you needed to help them. Sarah and Emily weren't just your family, they were ours too. Emily was the only grandchild they had. Sarah was like a daughter to Mom. The weight of that realization settled over Jake like a physical burden. In trying to spare his family from his pain, he'd robbed them of the chance to share it, to heal together, to support each other through the worst thing that had ever happened to any of them. "I've been such a fool," Jake whispered. "Yeah, you have. But you're alive, and that's what matters now." Michael gestured toward the house behind them. "From the looks of things, you've built something good here. The people I talk to in town, they think the world of you. They don't know who I really am, don't they?" Michael pulled out the newspaper again, studying the photograph of Jake rescuing Annie. "This looks like exactly who you really are, Jake. A man who runs toward danger to help others. A man who puts other people's lives before his own. That's the brother I remember." Jake studied the photograph with new eyes, seeing not just the dramatic rescue, but the culmination of 3 years of quiet service to a community that had embraced him. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe this was who he'd always been, underneath the guilt and self-punishment. "Mom and Dad," Jake said, would they want to see me?" Michael's smile was the first genuine warmth Jake had seen from him since he'd arrived. "Jake, they've never stopped wanting to see you. Dad keeps your room exactly the way you left it. And Mom still makes your favorite cookies every Christmas morning. Just in case." The image of his parents maintaining hope for 15 years, while he'd been convinced they were better off without him, was both heartbreaking and healing. Maybe it wasn't too late to repair what he'd broken. Maybe families were stronger than he'd given them credit for. "There's something else," Michael said, reaching into his coat pocket again. This time, he pulled out a small velvet box, worn smooth with age. "I've been carrying this around for 2 years, ever since Dad's heart attack. He made me promise that if I ever found you, I'd give it to you." Jake opened the box with trembling fingers, revealing his father's watch, the same Timex that had been passed down through 3 generations of Sullivan men. The inscription on the back read, "To my son, who carries our name with honor. He said a man's time isn't over until he decides it is," Michael explained. "He said you'd know when you were ready to start measuring your days instead of just surviving them." Jake fastened the watch around his wrist, feeling the weight of family history and expectation settle into place. For the first time in 15 years, he felt connected to something larger than his own grief, part of a story that had begun before him and would continue after him. "I want to come home," he said, "for Christmas. I want to see them. They'd like that. We all would." Michael stood up, brushing snow from his pants. "But what about this place? These people who've become your family?" Jake looked at his house, at the life he'd built in Cedar Ridge, at the community that had saved him by refusing to let him remain invisible. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, filled him with anxiety, but the thought of not reconciling with his blood family while he still could was worse. "I guess I need to learn that having one family doesn't mean losing another," Jake said. "These people taught me that love multiplies instead of dividing." Michael smiled, and for a moment he looked like the younger brother Jake remembered. "Sounds like you've got some wise neighbors." "The wisest? Especially a 10-year-old girl who's been giving me life lessons since the day I met her." As the afternoon light began to fade, the 2 brothers sat on the porch of Jake's new home and planned his return to his old one. It wouldn't be easy. 15 years of absence couldn't be erased with a single conversation. But for the first time since Sarah and Emily died, Jake Sullivan felt like he might be worthy of the love his family had never stopped offering. The wooden cross sat waiting inside, nearly finished and ready for its journey to Nebraska. But now it would carry more than just grief and guilt to that distant cemetery. It would carry gratitude, reconciliation, and the promise of a man who'd finally learned that healing didn't require forgetting, and that moving forward didn't mean leaving love behind. The news of Jake's family reunion spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed of wildfire, though thankfully with more warmth than destruction. By the time Michael left for his hotel in the neighboring town, Jake had insisted he stay for a few days to get properly acquainted with his new life. Half the community seemed to know that their adopted hero had a complicated past that was about to catch up with him. Annie Watson was among the first to arrive the next morning, her young face serious with concern as she knocked on Jake's front door. She'd brought fresh-baked muffins from her father's kitchen and the kind of direct questions that only children felt comfortable asking. "Papa says your brother found you because of the newspaper story," she said without preamble, settling herself at Jake's kitchen table with the familiarity of someone who considered this a second home. "He says your family thought you were dead." Jake poured himself coffee with hands that were steadier than they'd been yesterday, though his mind was still reeling from Michael's visit. The framed photograph of his original family now sat openly on the mantelpiece, no longer hidden but displayed alongside pictures of Cedar Ridge's community events, a visual representation of two worlds finally beginning to merge. "That's right," he confirmed, sitting across from Annie. "I made some poor choices after my wife and daughter died. I thought it would be easier for everyone if I just disappeared." "That was dumb," Annie said with characteristic bluntness, then immediately softened her tone. "I mean, I understand why you thought that, but it was still dumb. When people love you, they want to know you're okay, even when you're sad." The simple wisdom of her words hit Jake harder than Michael's anger had. From the mouth of a 10-year-old came a truth he'd spent 15 years avoiding, that love wasn't diminished by grief, and that protecting people from your pain often caused them more suffering than sharing it would have. "You're right," Jake admitted. "It was dumb, but I'm going to try to fix it now. Are you going to Nebraska for Christmas?" "Yes, I need to see my parents to apologize and try to make things right." Jake hesitated, then asked the question that had been keeping him awake. "What do you think about that?" Annie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I think it's good. Families should be together for Christmas, especially when they've been apart for too long." She paused, then added with a child's directness, "But you're coming back, right? This is your home now, too." The certainty in her voice steadied him. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm coming back. Cedar Ridge is my home now. You're my family, too." Relief flooded Annie's features, and Jake realized how worried she'd been that his reunion with his blood relatives might mean losing him entirely. The thought that this child, this whole community, had become so invested in his staying was both humbling and healing. The rest of the morning brought a steady stream of visitors, each offering their own perspective on Jake's situation. Martha Henderson arrived with a care package of homemade preserves and practical advice about traveling in winter weather. Sheriff Murphy stopped by to share his own experience of reconnecting with estranged family members, emphasizing the importance of patience and forgiveness, both for others and for oneself. Dr. Reynolds came by around noon, ostensibly to check on Jake's continued recovery, but really to discuss the logistics of Jake's temporary absence and what it would mean for his new role as medical assistant. "The position will be waiting when you return," Dr. Reynolds assured him, settling into Jake's living room with the comfortable authority of someone who'd become both mentor and friend. "Take all the time you need. Some healing can't be rushed. I don't want to let the community down," Jake said. "They've invested so much in giving me this chance. Jake, you saved Annie Watson's life and brought this town together in a way I haven't seen in decades. You could take a year's sabbatical and people would still be grateful." Dr. Reynolds leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. "Besides, what you're doing, reconciling with your family, that's part of the healing this community wants for you. We didn't save you just so you could keep running from your past." That afternoon, Jake found himself at the cemetery on the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, standing before the modest headstone of Annie's mother. He'd come here occasionally during his 3 years in town, drawn by the peaceful silence and the way the elevated position offered a view of the entire valley. But today, he was here for a different reason. "I figured I'd find you here." Jake turned to see Preacher Watson approaching, his breath visible in the cold air. The minister had aged visibly since the fire, the stress of nearly Losing his daughter and rebuilding his life had taken its toll, but there was a peace in his bearing that spoke of faith, tested and proven strong. "I come here sometimes, when I need to think," Jake admitted. "It's quiet, and the view helps put things in perspective." Preacher Watson nodded, joining Jake at the gravesite of his late wife. "Catherine always said this spot had the best view in the county. She used to bring Annie up here for picnics when she was little, or pointing out all the houses and telling her the stories of the families who lived in them." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes. Two men who'd both lost wives too soon and learned to carry that grief without letting it define them entirely. "Annie tells me you're planning to visit your family for Christmas," Preacher Watson said eventually. "I am. It's time. Past time, really." Jake kicked at a clump of snow with his boot. "I'm nervous about it. 15 years is a long time to be gone. The parable of the prodigal son suggests that time doesn't diminish a parent's love, only intensifies it," the preacher offered gently. "Your family has been carrying hope for 15 years. That's not a burden you need to feel guilty about. It's a gift you need to accept. What if I can't be the son they remember? What if I'm too broken, too changed?" Preacher Watson smiled, the expression warm despite the cold wind. "Jake, you're not the same man who left Nebraska 15 years ago. You're better. You've been tested by fire, literally and figuratively, and you've chosen compassion over bitterness, service over selfishness. Your family isn't getting back the man they lost. They're getting the man that loss helped you become." As they walked back down the hill toward town, Jake felt something settling in his chest. Not peace exactly, but a sense of rightness about the path ahead. The wooden cross was finished now, sitting wrapped in soft cloth and ready for its journey. The arrangements had been made. He would drive to Nebraska on December 20th, spend Christmas with his family, visit Sarah and Emily's graves, and return to Cedar Ridge by New Year's Day. But first, there was one more thing he needed to do. That evening, Jake stood before the assembled congregation of Cedar Ridge Community Church, which was meeting in the town hall while their regular building underwent repairs from fire damage. Nearly everyone in town had come, drawn by word that Jake wanted to address the community before his departure. He'd never been comfortable speaking to crowds, but looking out at the sea of familiar faces, people who'd fed him, housed him, employed him, and loved him back to life, he found his voice. 3 years ago, "I came to this town as a broken man," he began, his words carrying clearly in the quiet hall. "I was running from my past, from my pain, from everything that connected me to the life I'd lost. I thought I was protecting the people I cared about by staying away, but I was really just protecting myself from the possibility of getting hurt again." He paused, finding Annie's face in the crowd. She was sitting with her father in the front row, her attention fixed on him with the intensity of someone following a particularly important story. "You could have left me on the margins, and I would have been grateful for even that small kindness. Instead, you welcomed me into your homes, your hearts, your lives. You gave me work that mattered, friendships that sustained me, and a purpose I'd thought I'd lost forever." Martha Henderson wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, while Sheriff Murphy nodded approvingly from his position near the back of the hall. "I'm going home for Christmas, to Nebraska, to the family I left behind 15 years ago. I need to make amends for the pain I caused by disappearing, and I need to finally say goodbye to my wife and daughter properly." Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But I want all of you to know that this," he gestured to encompass the room, the people, the community, "this is home now too. You've taught me that families aren't just about blood relations. They're about people who choose to love you, even when you don't love yourself." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and Jake saw more than a few people dabbing at their eyes. "When I come back after New Year's, I'll be ready to fully embrace the life we've built together. No more running, no more hiding from the possibility of happiness. You've given me the greatest gift anyone can give another person, the chance to start over while still honoring what came before." As Jake sat down to thunderous applause, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he'd carried for so long. He'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. The journey ahead would be difficult, confronting his parents' pain, visiting graves he'd avoided for 15 years, reconciling two very different versions of himself. But for the first time since Sarah and Emily died, Jake Sullivan felt ready to be fully alive again. Annie was the first to reach him when the formal meeting ended, throwing her arms around his waist with the fierce affection of someone who'd claimed him as family. "I'm proud of you," she whispered against his shirt, "and I'll be here when you get back." "I'm counting on it," Jake whispered back, meaning every word. Tomorrow he would begin the journey toward reconciliation and healing. Tonight, he was surrounded by the family he'd chosen and who had chosen him in return. After 15 years of winter, Jake Sullivan was finally ready for spring. The farmhouse looked exactly the way Jake remembered it, down to the weathered red barn and the crooked fence post his father had been meaning to fix for 20 years. Snow covered the Nebraska fields like a clean white sheet, and smoke curled from the chimney in the gathering December twilight. Jake sat in his truck at the end of the long driveway, engine running and hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to summon the courage to drive those final 100 yards. He'd been on the road for 8 hours, stopping twice to call Michael and once to seriously consider turning around and heading back to Cedar Ridge. The wooden cross sat wrapped on the passenger seat beside him. Along with a photo album Martha Henderson had helped him put together, pictures of his new life, his new community, evidence that the broken man who'd left 15 years ago had found a way to heal. Through the kitchen window, he could see movement, his mother setting the table for dinner, just as she had every evening of his childhood. The sight of her, smaller and more fragile than his memory had preserved, nearly undid his resolve. Margaret Sullivan was 74 now, her hair completely white and her movements careful in the way of those who'd learned that bones grew brittle with age. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Annie. "You can do this. We believe in you." The simple message from the 10-year-old, who'd become his anchor, gave him the strength to put the truck in drive and slowly make his way up the familiar gravel path. By the time he parked beside the house, the front door was open and his father was standing on the porch. Thomas Sullivan looked older than his 76 years. The heart attack Michael had mentioned having left its mark in the way he moved and the careful way he held himself. But his eyes, those same brown eyes that ran through the Sullivan bloodline, were bright with an emotion Jake couldn't quite name. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other across 15 years of silence and regret. Then Margaret Sullivan appeared beside her husband, one hand pressed to her heart and the other reaching out as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Jacob," she whispered, and the sound of his name spoken in his mother's voice broke something open in Jake's chest. That had been frozen for too long. He was out of the truck and up the porch steps before conscious thought could interfere. And then he was in his mother's arms for the first time since he was 25 years old. She felt smaller than he remembered, more fragile. But her embrace was as fierce as it had been when he was a boy, coming home from school with scraped knees and wounded pride. "My boy," she murmured against his shoulder, her voice thick with tears. "My dear boy, you came home." Thomas Sullivan's hand settled on Jake's back, heavy with paternal love and forgiveness. "Welcome home, son." They stood there on the porch in the gathering darkness, a family reunited by tragedy and loss, and the stubborn persistence of love that refuses to let go even when hope seems foolish. Jake wept openly, for the first time since Sarah and Emily's funeral. 15 years of suppressed grief pouring out in great, shuddering sobs that left him feeling empty and clean. "I'm sorry," he managed between gasps. "I'm so sorry I left. I'm sorry I didn't call. I'm sorry for all the pain I caused." "Hush now," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of mothers everywhere. "You're here now. That's what matters." They moved inside to the kitchen, where the familiar smells of his childhood, pot roast and fresh bread, and the lavender sachets his mother kept in the linen closet, wrapped around Jake like a warm blanket. The house looked almost exactly as he'd left it. down to the family photographs on the mantelpiece and his mother's collection of ceramic roosters on the windowsill. "We never gave up hope," Thomas said as they settled around the kitchen table where Jake had eaten thousands of meals as a boy. "Your mother always said she'd know if you were gone for good." "Said a mother's heart would feel it," Margaret nodded, reaching across the table to take Jake's hands in hers. "I could feel you out there somewhere hurting but alive. I prayed every night that you'd find your way home when you were ready." Jake pulled out the photo album Martha had helped him prepare, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it to the first page. "I want to tell you about where I've been, what I've been doing, the people who saved me when I couldn't save myself." For the next hour, Jake walked his parents through his journey from broken veteran to beloved community member. He showed them pictures of Cedar Ridge, of his house, of the fire rescue that had changed everything. He told them about Annie and Martha and Dr. Reynolds, about finding purpose in serving others and meaning in small acts of kindness. "This little girl," Margaret said, studying a photo of Annie helping Jake paint his front porch. "She looks like our Emily." "She does," Jake agreed. "That's part of what scared me at first. But she taught me that loving someone new doesn't diminish the love you have for those you've lost. It just proves that your heart is still capable of growing." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his weathered face creased with pride. "Sounds like you've built yourself a good life, son. Sarah and Emily would be proud of the man you've become." The mention of his wife and daughter brought Jake to the real purpose of his visit. He reached for the wrapped wooden cross, his hands steady now with resolve. "I need to visit them tomorrow," he said quietly. "I need to finally say goodbye properly. Will you come with me?" Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she nodded firmly. "We've been waiting 15 years to grieve with you." "Jogub, of course we'll come." As they sat in the warm kitchen, sharing stories and bridging 15 years of separation, Jake felt the final pieces of his shattered heart beginning to knit themselves back together. The journey wasn't complete. There were still conversations to be had, forgiveness to be given and received, graves to be visited. But for the first time since he was 25 years old, Jake Sullivan felt like he was exactly where he belonged, outside. Snow continued to fall on the Nebraska farmland, blanketing the past in pristine white and promising a clean start for whatever came next. Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear over the Nebraska farmland, the kind of winter day that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds under a brilliant blue sky. Jake woke in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by the memorabilia his parents had preserved exactly as he'd left it. His high school football trophies, the model airplanes he'd built with his father, the worn paperback novels that had transported him to other worlds during long summer afternoons. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted up from the kitchen, along with the sound of his mother humming Christmas carols as she prepared their traditional breakfast. For a moment, Jake could almost pretend he was 17 again, home for the holidays, without the weight of loss and guilt that had defined his adult life. But the wooden cross sitting on his dresser, wrapped in soft cloth and ready for its purpose, reminded him that some journeys couldn't be postponed indefinitely. They drove to Oakwood Cemetery in Thomas's old Ford pickup, the same truck Jake had learned to drive in when he was 14. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill outside town, its wrought iron gates open to welcome visitors on this holiest of days. Many of the graves were decorated with Christmas wreaths and fresh flowers, evidence of families who'd come to include their departed loved ones in the holiday celebrations. Sarah and Emily's headstones were simple granite markers, side by side under the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree. Someone, probably Michael, had been maintaining the plot, keeping the grass trimmed and the headstones clean. Fresh evergreen boughs lay across both graves, their pine scent mixing with the cold, clean air. Jake stood frozen at the foot of the graves, the wooden cross heavy in his hands. 15 years of imagined conversations seemed to evaporate in the face of this moment. What did you say to people you'd failed to protect, whose deaths you'd spent decades believing you could have prevented? Margaret Sullivan took her son's arm gently, her presence both comforting and anchoring. "Take your time, dear. There's no hurry." "I don't know what to say to them," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to apologize for not being there, for surviving when they didn't, for staying away so long. Thomas moved to stand beside his son, his weathered hand settling on Jake's shoulder. Maybe start with the truth. Tell them what's in your heart. Jake knelt in the snow between the two graves, setting the wooden cross carefully on the ground. His hands traced the carved roses and the small horse, remembering the countless hours he'd spent perfecting each detail. "Hello, Sarah," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Hello, my sweet Emily. I'm sorry it took me so long to come see you." The words came slowly at first, then in a rush, as 15 years of suppressed grief and love poured out. Jake told them about the dark years after their deaths, about his guilt and self-punishment and the way he'd tried to disappear rather than face a world without them. He told them about Cedar Ridge and the people who'd saved him, about Annie and her wisdom and the way she'd reminded him that love multiplies rather than diminishes. "I met a little girl who has your spirit." "Emily," he said, tears freezing on his cheeks in the cold air. "She's brave and smart and kind, just like you were. She helped me remember that being happy doesn't mean forgetting you. It means honoring the love you taught me by sharing it with others." Margaret and Thomas stood quietly behind him, their own tears falling as they witnessed their son finally saying the goodbye he'd been unable to speak 15 years ago. "I brought you something," Jake continued, unwrapping the wooden cross. "I know it can't make up for not being here all these years, but I wanted you to have something made with love, something that shows how much you still mean to me." He placed the cross between the two headstones, its carved details catching the morning light. The roses for Sarah's garden, the horse for Emily's dreams, the careful craftsmanship that spoke of hours spent in loving remembrance. "I have a home now," Jake said, his voice growing stronger. "A place where people care about me, where I can help others the way I couldn't help you. I hope you'd be proud of the man I'm trying to become." A gentle wind stirred the evergreen boughs, and for a moment Jake could swear he felt something, not quite presence but not absence either. A sense of approval, of love that transcended death, of permission to live fully in their memory rather than dying slowly in their absence. "I'll always love you both," he whispered. "But I'm ready to live again. Really live, not just survive. And I'll come back to visit, I promise. No more running away." As they walked back to the truck, Margaret slipped her arm through Jake's. "They know you love them, dear. They've always known. The question was whether you'd allow yourself to know it too." That afternoon, sitting around his parents' dinner table with Michael and his wife and children, family Jake was meeting for the first time. He felt the final pieces of his broken heart click into place. The guilt wasn't gone entirely, perhaps it never would be, but it no longer defined him. He was Jacob Sullivan, beloved son and brother, honored veteran and community healer, surrogate father to a wise little girl in Montana who was probably counting the days until his return. For the first time in 15 years, Jake Sullivan was whole, and he was ready to go home to Cedar Ridge, carrying with him not just the grief and guilt of his past, but the love and forgiveness that would shape his future. Jake returned to Cedar Ridge on New Year's Day to find his house draped in welcome home banners and his front yard filled with more people than should have been able to fit in such a small space. The entire town seemed to have turned out for his homecoming, bundled in winter coats and clutching steaming mugs of what he suspected was Martha Henderson's famous hot chocolate. Annie Watson was the first to spot his truck coming down Main Street, and her delighted shriek of "He's back!" sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered crowd. By the time Jake parked in his own driveway, she was practically bouncing with anticipation, though she waited with visible restraint for him to get out of the truck before launching herself into his arms. "You came back," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I knew you would, but I was still worried. I promised I would," Jake replied, holding her tight and marveling at how right it felt to be surrounded by these people who'd become his chosen family. "Cedar Ridge is my home. You're my family." Wild horses couldn't keep me away. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had seen in years. Martha Henderson had organized a potluck dinner that sprawled across 3 houses, and it seemed like everyone in town had contributed something to the feast. Jake found himself passed from conversation to conversation, sharing stories of his reunion with his parents and listening to updates on everything that had happened during his 2-week absence. Dr. Reynolds pulled him aside during the festivities. His weathered face creased with satisfaction. "Your timing is perfect," he said. "Mrs. Fletcher's been having chest pains, and young Tommy Morrison split his chin open yesterday sledding. I could use my medical assistant back. It's good to be needed," Jake replied, and meant it. The work that awaited him, caring for people, being useful, making a difference in lives that mattered, felt like the greatest gift he could have asked for. But it was Sheriff Murphy who delivered the most significant news. "The county commissioners approved our request," he said, settling beside Jake on the church steps as the celebration continued around them. "You're officially Cedar Ridge's emergency medical coordinator now. Comes with a small raise and a lot more responsibility." Jake stared at the man who'd become both colleague and friend. "Emergency medical coordinator? Town's growing. We need someone with your training to handle medical emergencies until the ambulance arrives. You'd work with the volunteer fire department, coordinate with hospitals in the region, maybe even train some of the younger folks in basic first aid." Murphy's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. "Course, if you're not interested, I suppose we could find someone else." "I'm interested," Jake said quickly, then laughed at his own eagerness. 6 months ago, he'd been a drifter with no ties and no future. Now he was discussing career advancement in a town that had become more home to him than anywhere he'd ever lived. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration gradually wound down, Jake found himself standing in his living room with Annie, looking at the community quilt that now hung prominently on his wall. Martha Henderson and the other women of Cedar Ridge had worked on it throughout his absence, creating something that told the story of his journey from invisible stranger to beloved family member. The center square showed the moment of his rescue of Annie from the fire, rendered in careful stitches and vibrant colors. But surrounding it were dozens of smaller squares depicting moments from his 3 years in Cedar Ridge. Jake helping at the Henderson Ranch, reading with children at the library, assisting Dr. Reynolds at the clinic, sharing meals with neighbors who'd become family. "It's beautiful," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mama Henderson says it's our family tree," Annie explained, pointing to the various squares. "Not the kind with names and dates, but the kind that shows how people choose to love each other." The wisdom of that observation, coming from a 10-year-old who'd lost her mother too young and found healing in helping others heal, struck Jake with the force of revelation. This was what family really meant, not just blood relations or legal obligations, but the conscious choice to care for each other through good times and bad. That evening, after the last well-wisher had gone home and Annie had been collected by her father, Jake sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee and his father's watch ticking steadily on his wrist. The house felt different than it had when he'd left, not just because of the welcome home decorations, but because he was different. The man who'd driven to Nebraska 2 weeks ago had been carrying 15 years of guilt and incomplete grief. The man who'd returned was carrying love, forgiveness, and the kind of peace that comes from finally accepting that happiness and sorrow could coexist in the same heart. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "So proud of you, dear. Dad and I are planning to visit this spring to meet your Cedar Ridge family." The thought of his parents meeting Annie and Martha and all the people who'd saved him filled Jake with quiet joy. 2 families, separated by geography but connected by love, finally able to come together in celebration rather than sorrow. Outside his window, Cedar Ridge was settling into its evening routines. Lights glowed warmly in kitchen windows, smoke curled from chimneys, and the snow-covered streets looked like something from a Christmas card. But this wasn't a temporary vacation or a place to hide. This was home in all its messy, beautiful, complicated reality. Jake Sullivan had started his journey as a broken man running from love because it hurt too much to lose. He was ending it as a healed man running toward love, because connection, not isolation, was what made life worth living. The fire that had nearly destroyed him had also forged him into someone stronger, someone capable of saving others because he'd finally learned to save himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve his community and care for the people who'd become his family. But tonight, sitting in his warm house surrounded by gifts from generous hearts, Jake was exactly where he belonged. Sometimes the people we overlook the most are the ones willing to give everything for us. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, we become the people others can overlook no longer, not because we're perfect, but because we've learned that love shared is love multiplied, and that home isn't a place you're born to, but a place you choose to build. One act of kindness at a time. In Cedar Ridge, Montana, a homeless cowboy had jumped into fire to save a little girl. What all 500 townspeople did in return had shocked everyone, including the cowboy himself. They'd given him something more precious than shelter or employment or even gratitude. They'd given him home, and Jake Sullivan intended to spend the rest of his life proving worthy of that gift. One rescued life, one healed heart, one moment of grace at a time.